This is a country that has a missile system that was designed to obliterate the United States. And while they have bluffed over and over and over and over and over about where the red line is, we only have to be wrong once for this to get out of control.
Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is Peter Zeihan. Peter is a geopolitical strategist, and his expertise is at the intersection of demography, economics, energy, politics, technology, and security. He founded his firm Zeihan on Geopolitics in 2012, following a dozen years as a geopolitical analyst for Stratfor. Peter's written 4 books, including The Accidental Superpower, which has a new edition recently published, providing updates to his analysis from across the 10 years since the book's first publication. His 4th book is The End of the World is Just the Beginning, mapping the collapse of globalization, which was published in June of 2022 and was a New York Times bestseller. Peter, welcome back to Technovation. It's great to speak with you today.
To be back.
Wonderful. I thought we'd begin, Peter, with some really interesting insights you have about why you believe that Stalin was the most important or influential person in the past 500 years. Explain how he set the table for the world order for most of the past century.
It wasn't so much for what he did or where he lived, but because of who he terrified. Americans realized in the late 1940s that we were on the tail end of World War II, all of a sudden gearing up for another war with a much more powerful enemy on the plains of Europe. And we knew that was a war that we could not win. So we knew we needed tens of millions of people to stand not with us, but in front of us. And convincing the Europeans to sign up to be cannon fodder right after World War II was kind of a high bar. So we knew we needed some way to induce them to take that role. And our solution was globalization. We sent out our Navy to patrol the global oceans so that any maritime shipping could go anywhere without an escort. It never happened before in human history. And the result was the trade order that we now have today. None of that would have happened if we weren't scared by Stalin.
Well, you note in your most recent book, The Seeds of Deglobalization were sown decades ago. Provide an overview, if you would, of why it's happened and why it's been inevitable.
Well, keep in mind, globalization was a reaction to an American security fear. So we never invested our economy in the system in the first place. So, number one, the security environment's changed. Even with the Russians back on the warpath, they're a pale shadow of what they were during the Cold War. So we no longer feel we need to have a global alliance. In addition, 75 years later, there are a lot of secondary economies out there that have some heft. So the idea that the United States, even in its current strength in terms of its consumer base and the size of its economy, could directly subsidize all of that, that was never going to fly. And politically, the US has moved on. So we never invested our economy in the system. We don't have an internationalized economy, but we provide the security for everyone else to have an internationalized economy, and that doesn't fly anymore. So we're just backing away from the system. There's no country, there's no coalition of countries that can take our place, either as the market of first and last resort or as the global security guarantor. So that ends it right there. Second, and just as importantly, is after 75 years of globalization, we have had 75 years of industrialization and 75 years of urbanization. And when you move from the farm into the city, kids are no longer free labor. They're an expense, and adults aren't stupid, so we had fewer of them. If you fast forward that from 1950 to today, we've seen global birth rates drop by more than 3/4. And in an increasing percentage of the world's populations, there are no longer enough people under age 45 to consume in volume. China's on that list now. And so there isn't a population structure to support global trade anymore anyway. So whether you look at it from the guns or the butter point of view, this chapter of history is very rapidly coming to a close.
Fascinating analysis. You note that demographic inversion is going to lead to economic freefall across many industrialized countries. And you point out there simply aren't enough young people across the industrialized world, as you noted, given the fall in birth rates. You've also noted that many of these countries passed the point of no return, so to say, in the 1980s. And you've also noted that the worst off of all is China. You just alluded to that. In your latest book, you noted, and I quote you here, China faces a deindustrialization that is nothing less than mythic. It almost certainly faces a political disintegration and even decivilization. Can you describe what that entails and why that's the case?
When an economic model breaks, the political system always breaks. There has not been an exception to that throughout human history. And the Chinese system is based on mass import of raw commodities, most notably energy and the stuff they need to grow their own food, and a mass export of finished goods to end markets that have consumers. Well, the consumer market is now in danger and shrinking, and trade tensions are destroying the front end of that as well. And that's before you start talking about Americans' new obsession with things like semiconductors or rare earth metals. There's very little that the Chinese can do to influence events in these topics beyond their shores, much less dictate American policy. So it was always an issue where the single greatest guarantor of Chinese economic success was the United States Navy. And that was never a very good long term bet in the first place. Since the book has come out, the situation in China has gotten so much worse. We now have the public system in China admitting that they've overcounted their population by more than 100 million people. We now have official statistics suggesting that their birth rate has dropped by more in the last 6 years than what happened to the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust. And now we have private economists and private demographers saying that the overcount in the population is probably closer to 250 million, all of the missing millions under age 40. So not only is consumption-led growth now impossible in the People's Republic, they have aged past even the theoretical stage where you could press gang women into rape camps to generate a higher birth rate, which is something that every once in a while when I'm in Asia, people suggest is something that might happen, which I might not have a high respect for the humane levels of the CPC, but I have never thought they wouldn't go that far. But now not even that is an option. I mean, unless we have like a sudden breakthrough in Star Wars style cloning, where you can grow a bunch of 20 somethings with full skill sets in under 2 years, this ends within 10 years. And by this, I mean the Chinese system itself. This is a system that can't feed itself, it can't fuel itself, and it no longer has enough people to try to go back to a subsistence agricultural system. We are looking at a breaking of what it means to have a Han ethnicity in just the next few decades.
And what does that entail in practice? Like on a what will China become? Obviously, people will still be there, the land will still be there. What then reigns? Chaos? Who leads that? What sort of how does it function, or how does it not, according to
Well,
what
well,
you
let's
described?
start by saying that this is all guesswork because this has never happened before in civilizational history. The closest, perhaps, parallel we have, and it's not a great one, is the population collapses we saw in the late Roman period when a combination of slaving and disease gutted a lot of the provinces. And yes, you see a breakdown in civil control to the degree that you basically have a depopulation through lack of security, lack of disease, lack of healthcare, lack of economic activity, and entire areas basically resort into barbarism. In this specific case in China, China's history is actually replete with civilizational collapses in the past. If my math is right, this is going to be the 27th civilizational collapse where the central government has simply collapsed. Huge swaths of territory that we think today of being economically vital basically revert to the term marches, where basically you've got pockets of civilization that can kind of hold back the night, and then big swaths of territory where no one holds sway. In Chinese parlance, it's warlordism. The problem, of course, in a place like China is most of the people live in an area where you can't grow food unless you also have a significant waterworks system. So if you break down civilizational pillars and central control, the ability to maintain those networks goes by. Also, the Chinese import 80% of the inputs they need to grow their own food. So on top of all of this, having a mass famine in large sections of the population, especially in the North China Plain, where the inputs are the highest and the demands for a waterworks system are the highest. Historically speaking, of those 27 collapses, about half of them have kind of followed some version of the same pattern where the North China Plain has famine, has warlordism, has an attempt by Beijing to basically invade and oppress itself to stability, which typically kills half the population. And then you have the southern city states from Shanghai to Guangzhou that go their own way. and basically cut deals with foreign powers to import capital, technology, and above all else, food in order to continue existing. Most of these cities have imported the majority of their calories for the last 1700 years. And the modern era that we're in, where all of mainland China is under a single political authority and Guangzhou gets its food from the plains around Beijing, that's not normal for them. So this is going to sound horrible, but we're actually reverting to something closer to the historical mean here. And the historical mean is not pretty.
Very interesting analysis. Part of the demographic challenges you described are part of the industrialization that most countries have gone through, but part of it also self-inflicted, of course, with the one-child policy on top of that. All that you've described, I would imagine, would not be news necessarily to President Xi. And you've said that,
Probably.
and well, you said that in many ways his actions are actually hastening the country's demise. And I wonder how much of that is the unintended consequences. Do you see him attempting to put to action something that would at least stave off the inevitable?
I think the government system at the top is degraded to the point that useful policy, if it happens, is more like monkeys on a keyboard. I don't mean that as a racial slur. I just mean that Xi has so purged the system of anyone who is competent that no one even brings him information anymore. So he's making decisions in a complete vacuum, guided by nothing more than propaganda. Now, we know 5 years ago, before the purge of the bureaucracy was complete, that he was fully aware of the limitations that China faced at home and abroad. He knew he was dependent on the US market. He knew he was dependent on the US Navy. He knew he was dependent on international trade to keep the lights on. He was aware of all of this and more. But with the purge of bureaucracy, no one is any longer presenting him with basic information about what's going on at home or abroad. And whenever something does penetrate this kind of hermetic seal he's got around himself in the Forbidden City, everything's news. And one person, no matter how competent, can't micromanage a country of 1 billion people. And he's destroyed all the avenues of communication and information flow. So as a result, the government, the bureaucracy is either making things up as they go, or more likely doing nothing because they don't want to be called to the account for something they weren't specifically approved for, because that gets you killed. I don't see them recovering from this. About the only scenario I can think of right now where the Chinese might be able to start down a path that's a little bit more sustainable, at least buy them a little bit of time, is if Xi were to die by accident, and all of these nearly brain dead people that he's installed on the Politburo, not because they're competent, not because they're yes men, because they're silent, if they were collectively to come to the realization that they need to go out and job hunt for people who actually can do math and run a small town, that's a lot of ifs to get to a possible then.
Yeah, I want to talk about the broader implications of what you've described to the rest of the world. China still produces, as you noted, a lot of goods for the rest of the world, still being a manufacturing hub. And it's not as though the rest of the world, the U.S. very much included among that, have alternatives in place that would be able to make up for this,
Yeah.
especially if the demise comes quickly. You predicted perhaps even in the next 10 years. What would you, if you were, as you do, in fact, whisper in the ear of policymakers in the United States? What
I'm
sorts
not
of
the whispering kind of guy, but thank you.
you're speaking loudly in rooms with leaders in the United States. What sort of advice do you provide to ensure that the downstream impact of this isn't also disastrous for economies like ours?
Well, let's start with the reality of the exposure. The Chinese are the king of the low end. If it deals with assembly or things that are not too technically challenging, this is where the Chinese can compete, because they compete on scale. As you move up the value added scale, they bring less and less to the table. This is an economy that has seen their costs of labor go up by a factor of 15 or 16 in the last 25 years, but labor productivity has barely tripled. So there aren't a lot of sectors where value add is the critical component of the mix, where the Chinese are players unless they just massively subsidize it, which they do. The places where they are competitive are in industries where the value add is very low, and it's usually about processing. And in those sectors, they're barring in the world leader. So whether it's aluminum or cobalt or copper, 40 to 70% of global processing for a lot of these materials is China-centric. Now, there's nothing about this processing process that is difficult or expensive or even time-consuming to relocate. But easy and cheap and fast is not the same as immediate and free. So when I think about things like aluminum or lithium, that's where the biggest shock will be. When I think about things like steel rebar, where the Chinese have an advantage because of their subsidies, it's not that this can't be done either, and it's not that we don't do it ourselves. It's just the shock to the system, if this were to end overnight, would be significant. But as you move up the value add, it becomes less and less of a factor. So high-end chemicals, mid-tier chemicals, automotive, things as simple as a spark plug the Chinese do, and they do it at scale, but they don't do it well, and they don't do it at a particularly competitive price point. So there really are, for the end result of things, the point of the spear in manufacturing, if you will, that I'm less worried about. It's the building block where I'm most concerned. Now, if you let the chips fall where they may in a free market system, most of that sort of industry is going to go to places with the cheapest energy and the cheapest cost of production of the ore. For most of these things, the ore is pretty spread out around the world, and the United States does have by far the cheapest electricity in the world because we have the best territory on the planet aside from Australia for green tech, and we have the cheapest natural gas on the planet, and we have the cheapest high caloric content coal. So if you let everything go in time, it will all come back here. My concern is it's going to be a shock. So I'm of the opinion that every day that China doesn't collapse is a gift because it gives us a day to get ready for the end of those supply lines. And we are seeing more and more and more of even this low end stuff coming back to the United States, with, I would argue, the Gulf Coast being the area that's going to be adding the most. Not only does it have the really cheap electricity and proximate industrial capacity in places like the Texas Triangle, the view of environmental protection in places like Louisiana, the Texas coast, are somewhat lower than the national average, which provides us some opportunity in that space.
But China was long the most populous country in the world. You've noted that perhaps by 2055 it will have half its current population. It's just recent months that, at least officially, India has taken over the title of most populous country in the world. How bullish or bearish are you regarding India's prospects?
Whenever I talk to the Indians, the first thing I make clear is you are not going to be the next China, and you do not want to be. The strength of the Chinese system is a dictatorial state that forces everybody into the same page, and a huge subsidy system that is financially wildly inefficient, but does allocate capital to productive uses in order to keep those populations happy and marching in the same direction. You're never going to get that in India. In India, capital isn't a political good. It actually has a value, which means that you don't make loans just to make loans. You don't make loans to guarantee high employment. You make loans because there might be a return on the other side. It's much more efficient in that way. Uh, and if you were to apply the Chinese model to India, you'd probably end up with the same rapid industrialization, but then followed by the same civilizational collapse. And India's smarter than that. They're better than that. That doesn't mean that India doesn't have its own problems. Oh my God, India has its problems. Their problem is that they basically have 30 different regions and 30 different countries, 30 different economic systems, and they don't integrate well. It's not just a policy issue. It's not just a geography issue. It's a corruption issue. And that makes it difficult for the political leadership of one Indian state to integrate with another one, even if it's a perfect match. Politics there are very localized. It's a true federal system, kind of like the United States or Germany, where the national, state, and local governments all have roughly the same amount of power. And it makes policy making a mess. But it does mean that you can always learn from one another, which is why you have places like the Bangalore corridor that are basically first world economies, and other places are basically giant call centers, and other places have failed. But let me underline something on the population. Chinese data isn't great. They keep updating it, thank God. But I would argue that India actually surpassed the Chinese population something like 15 years ago. with the new insight we've gotten in just the last 12 months. So we've already been not so tiptoeing towards this new world for quite some time now. And we had a 5-year period where the Chinese were in a degree of information lockdown during COVID where we didn't get any good information. On the backside of that, we're finally seeing that a lot of these peaks in China, car sales, copper consumption, maybe didn't simply come in the last 12 months or even during COVID, but actually date back to like 2017, 2018. And on the demographic picture, it looks like it was a lot further back than that. Like we now know that the Chinese birth rate probably dropped below the American birth rate back in the early 90s.
Interesting points about how accurate the data is and how that might reflect differences there, as you point out. Well, we started our conversation with one Russian strongman. Let's move on to another one in Putin. In 2010, you predicted that Russia would invade Ukraine in 2022. Quite a prediction. Well done, Peter.
Sorry about that.
Why was that so clear to you then?
Okay, so there's two pieces to this. First, the why it has to happen. The Russian frontier in its current form is completely undefended. It's wide open, it's populated. There's no way for the Russians in any form, with no matter how competent their government, no matter how powerful their military, to patrol and secure the entire border system. It's something like 5,000 kilometers long. But if they were to advance past their current borders and to get to something that's a little bit more similar to what they had in the Soviet period, they could anchor their military in places of geographic constraint where mountains and seas can provide a defensive bulwark. And then they concentrate their forces on the places between those, like the Polish Gap, like the Bessarabian Gap in Romania, like the Caucasus coastal strips. And then their entire external boundaries are less than 500 miles. That's something that they can do. So they've been working on some version of this for the entirety that we have had an entity called Russia over 4 centuries. They achieved it under Stalin. They lost it with the post-Soviet collapse. And everything that they've done, and by they, I mean the Russian state, not Putin. This predates Putin. Everything that the Russian state has done since 1989 has been about reestablishing that outer crustal defense. Ukraine's not the first post-Soviet war with that goal. It's the 9th, and it won't be the last if they win. So that's the why. The why now is demographic. Russia has these peaks and troughs in their demographic structure that largely line up with either major wars or major centralization collapses and mismanagement, whether it's Khrushchev forcing everyone into apartments or World War II causing 20 million civilian deaths. You got these giant gouges out of their demographic structure, but none of them are as severe as what happened after 1992. The economic system collapsed. We had several years of a corrupt government under Yeltsin that basically did nothing to stop the free fall, culminating into the collapse of 1998. And during that period, the death rate soared, the birth rate crashed, and for almost 20 years, we had a death rate that was twice as high as the birth rate. And even if you believe the statistics that the Russians started making up 15 years ago, this is a population structure that is so far past the pale that recovery just isn't even theoretically possible, which means that the men that they have in their 20s are really their last group of deployable forces that they will ever have. And 2022 was kind of in the middle of the date range that I saw where if they waited any longer, they simply wouldn't have the people to even theoretically attempt a military solution. So it always had to happen. It always had to happen about then. And if they keep losing people at their current rate, and there's like 1,000 ifs that are condensed into that if, they probably can only sustain this for about another 6 to 9 years, and then they simply don't have the people to try.
Well, you've noted that Russia always does long wars, not quick ones.
Right. And when you're running out of people, that strategy doesn't work as well.
Exactly right. Well, you've noted that you're out of the prediction game on the war with Ukraine on in multiple places I've seen you speak, but I wonder if you can walk through what would need to happen for Ukraine to get the upper hand versus what would need to happen for Russia to do so.
Well, let's start with the Russians. As long as they can maintain supply flows from North Korea for artillery, from Iran for drones, and for China for electronics and metallurgy, You marry that to the Soviet arsenal, and they are not looking at a meaningful equipment shortage within the next 5 years. Based on how long China lasts, it could be a little bit longer than that. So at least in the midterm, they're fine on equipment. And because this is their last war, and they realize that, the manpower issue is not an issue either. It's just a question of how they politically manage drafting. I don't think that is going to be the thing that brings down the government. So minimum 5 years for the Russians, things look, I don't want to say hunky-dory, but they can maintain their flows. And they're finding new and innovative ways to use their old weapon systems in more devastating capacity. So, for example, the glide bombs are the most recent innovation, basically dropping a metric ton of explosives on an urban center and just bit by bit making the front zone completely uninhabitable, so that if you're the Ukrainian military, you lose an interest in defending something that no longer has a value. They started with the power centers. They're now going after things like apartment blocks and just making places completely unlivable. That's not, it's inhumane, but it's not a stupid strategy from a strategic point of view. And if you can cause enough havoc that the West realizes that the rebuilding might not be worth the cost, maybe, it's an open question about how long the Ukrainians can maintain defensive operations. It's a legitimate conclusion, no matter how horrible it sounds. On the other side, the issue is Crimea. Because of the shape of the land, because of the presence of the Dnieper River, any supply going into Crimea basically has to come from one of three routes. You've got a rail ferry bridge, basically bringing things in by water, that the Ukrainians have largely destroyed. They've also destroyed most of the Russian landing ships in general. So supplying by sea has become very, very hard. Number two, you've got the Kerch Bridge, which goes from Rostov-on-Don, or sorry, the railway goes in from Rostov-on-Don south into the Kerch Strait and then crossing into Crimea Peninsula. That's taken enough hits that its ability to take mass cargo has been limited pretty strictly. And I think with these new weapon systems that the Ukrainians have recently gotten, the Kerch Bridge is not going to be around much longer anyway. And then third, you've got a series of rail connections that are on the southern shore of Ukraine proper. And while they are in long-range rocket and artillery range in many cases, the Ukrainians don't have a liability to target the trains with artillery. So that's where the bulk of things are going right now. If Ukraine can cut that final rail system, then the Russians would be forced to ship anything to Crimea by truck from Russia proper through the Donbass, past Mariupol and Melitopol, and across a single road and rail system to get into Crimea proper. That's over 1,000-kilometer long supply line by truck, with the Ukrainians being able to basically interdict it at multiple spots. If we get to that point, and that is basically what seems to be the Ukrainians' goal for this summer, once they get air power, to try to cut that line, if they can do that, Crimea goes from a potential launch point for Russian forces to the most exposed portion of the entire Russian landmass. And the public humiliation of having a couple million Russians in Crimea starving because the Russians can't supply their own civilian population, much less their military population. The Ukrainians don't have to capture Crimea to generate that outcome. They simply have to interdict one train line. And if you can have a global humiliation of Putin, this is how about half of the governing systems in Russian history have ended, from either internal collapse or popular uprising, because the Russians have lost a war very, 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 very publicly. So some version of this is what went down for World War I. From some version of this is what went down for the Crimean War, ironically. And that seems to be the Ukrainians' short-term goal. And that is also not a stupid strategy. So both of these things can work, and both of them are very, very ugly.
Yeah, very interesting. Ukraine has the support of the Western world, and Russia has the support of countries like China and North Korea. So in many ways, this is a proxy war for China and the West to some degree, even if the primary actors are, of course, Russia and Ukraine. Are you fearful at all that the proxies might be drawn into the conflict?
At the moment, no. If there is going to be a conflict that involves China, it'll be under a series of very, very different circumstances. Remember, the Chinese can't project power more than about 1,000 miles 1,000 kilometers really, from their own shore. So the idea that they could get involved in something involving sea lanes in South Asia, or much less in Ukraine, beyond the pales. North Korea is obviously significantly less capacity in that regard. And in the case of Iran, Iran and Israel are actually getting along as well as it's possible for the two of them to get along right now. So I don't think that's a serious conflict either. I have never been of the opinion that a war between the United States and China is inevitable, much less imminent. I don't want to say it can't happen, but if we do get into a slugfest, the United States is going to put a few ships in the Indian Ocean basin, cut the energy artery, cut the manufactured goods artery, and we'll have a decivilizational collapse in China in under a year, complete with a famine. 5 years ago, Xi knew that. My only concern today is that he has so destroyed the capacity of information to flow within the Chinese system that maybe he's forgotten it.
The two countries we've primarily spoken about so far, China and Russia, are also led by paranoid dictators who have nuclear arms. And talk about the risks of the combination of those factors.
Yeah, not a non-factor. Now, to the degree that the United States has a missile defense system, it was designed for the Chinese system. And while they have been adding more and more silos, we have learned in the last year that corruption and theft within the Chinese procurement system is, if anything, bigger than what's going on in the Russian procurement system, with the nuclear forces being the one that has leaked out the most. Specifically, the Chinese general who is responsible for maintaining the silos stole the money that was supposed to go for the fuel for the rockets and just filled them up with water, which probably makes the rockets useless. I would not be willing to bet the existence of the United States on that fact, but there is no way that this is a single data point. This is something that is very easy to discover. So anything that he was trying to actually hide is probably worse. I don't want to say I don't worry about China at all, but not to the same degree as most people in the military industrial complex of the United States. I don't see it. I don't see the capacity for power projection. In the case of Russia, that is a much more serious threat. The number of deliverable weapon systems is much higher, and that's before you include the ones that have been mothballed but not dismantled. So you're talking about basically 1,000 delivery platforms today, and if they decided they wanted to bring their old stuff out, they could expand that by a factor of 5 or 6 theoretically. Our missile system is not designed for that, not just in terms of numbers, in terms of coverage. Our hardware, our fixed ground emplacements are on the West Coast and Alaska, designed for North Korea, designed for China. Our East Coast doesn't have that. We've got a lot of mobile systems, but not sufficient to cover all of our population centers. So if one of these red lines that the Russians keep lying about actually turns out to be real, then we could have a very serious problem. So we've got this fun little situation where we've got two kind of general camps in the United States. Those who take the red lines very, very seriously and think that as a result, we should become Neville Chamberlain and just let the Russians have whatever they want. If they want Ukraine, let them have it. If they want Poland, let them have it. If they want Germany, let them have it. Let them have all of NATO. Let them have Mexico. Basically, just stand by, stand back, and let the Russians do whatever they want. That's idiotic and not very American. The other side is like, we should give the Ukrainians every weapon system they possibly can, and we should allow them to target everything they want, whenever they want, however they want, and we should actively assist them. That's too extreme in the other direction. This is a country that has a missile system that was designed to obliterate the United States. And while they have bluffed over and over and over and over and over about where the red line is, we only have to be wrong once for this to get out of control. So I think the Biden administration, when it comes to security policy relating to Ukraine, has broadly struck the right degree of caution versus aggressiveness. Basically, what we've done for the last 2 years is, when the Russians state a red line, one country in NATO puts a toe across it just to see what happens. And then they step across it. And then other countries join in. And 3 weeks later, everyone's doing it. So this happened with artillery. This happened with the Storm Shadows. This happened with the Javelins. Most recently, It happened with allowing the Russians to use the ATCOM system to target Russian assets across the border from Kharkiv and to go after the places where the Russians were launching assaults on civilian populations. And just in the last 48 hours, that has now been expanded to pretty much the entire front. Ukraine, in the Americans' eyes now, can use our weapon systems to target any place in Russia that is actively generating a logistical hub to target Ukraine proper. And I would guess that in the next couple of months, even that limited restriction will go away as well. But one of these days, one of these red lines might actually be real. I am guessing here, but I would guess that it will be when Ukrainian forces feel they need to cross the border into Russia proper to physically break up the logistical hubs. We're not going to hit that this year, but it is something to start stressing about.
Yeah. Another strategic and important part of the world is Taiwan. And there's a lot of reason why that is contemplated as a risk in the future. And I wonder that is a conflict with China. And I wonder to what extent not only what you've described in terms of the existential challenges that China has, but on top of it, what they are seeing with the war in Ukraine. To what extent do you believe that this has dampened Xi's enthusiasm for conflict?
It's really hard to get a read on Xi because he doesn't have conversations with everybody, with anybody. So, you can tap phones and hack fax lines and emails in Russia and get a decent view of what's going on in the Kremlin, but Xi has conversations with no one. So it's all guesswork. And the fact that his decisions are not driven by what's going on in the world, they're just driven by what rare bits of information get into his head. And then conversations with no one about the details, it's kind of a fool's errand to predict. I would just underline that if there was a war with Taiwan, it would be the end of China. Not that there wouldn't be fallout, not that there wouldn't be blood, but it would be the end of the People's Republic. Also, even if in their wildest dreams that version of Chinese nationalism happened where they were able to conquer Taiwan intact in 2 weeks, so it doesn't solve any of their problems. And they can't operate their own semiconductor fabs. Those are manned by critical staff from other countries. You put them in charge of TSMC, they wouldn't know what to do with it. I don't see the gain here, aside from a little nationalist drum beating that you can then keep beating that drum as your country collapses around you and maybe use that to write the narrative for the next iteration of the Chinese government in an era of famine and no electricity. It doesn't seem like a winning play to me.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's turn to the United States a little bit more than we have so far. You've noted, you alluded earlier to the fact that we are a continental economy, and I know from past conversations that you've talked about the impact of deglobalization is therefore not going to be an existential problem for even the United States. Provide your analysis there, please.
Sure. So remember, globalization for us was a ploy to get everybody on our side. And if we had invested our economy into the global commons, it wouldn't have been a bribe. It wouldn't have been nearly as attractive. So today, only about 15% of our GDP comes from international trade. Roughly half of that is Mexico and Canada. Roughly half of what's left is exports of raw commodities like crude oil, refined product, and grain. So now you're talking about a total exposure of 3 to 4% of GDP. Now that's not nothing, and most of that is in the form of manufactured goods. So if we were to see a cutoff of everything overnight, we would have a glut of finance, food, and energy, and a shortage in electronics. That would be how we would basically feel it. We don't move on from that overnight. We don't move on from that without a considerable expense. But this isn't a civilization ending event like it will be in other places.
I've been fascinated by your analysis of the presidential election. We're speaking now in the summer
Oh
of
boy.
2024. But I mean, you are unequivocal. You say this will be a Biden win by a landslide.
Yeah.
Describe why that's the case.
Okay, so three and a half things. Number one, there's fewer Republicans than Democrats. And so the Republicans have always done well at the national level because the factions that make up the coalition don't fight among themselves. Well, Trump has not only started a civil war among Republicans, he's actually purged some of these factions like the business community and the national security community from the coalition altogether. So without all the Republicans in lockstep, there's no chance of a victory. Number two, people seem to have forgotten what happened during the midterms. Donald Trump told independents that their vote doesn't matter in the general election, and that's the only place that independents' vote matters. Trump wants it to be all about the primaries because that's where he dominates. And so in elections where he put his finger on the scale and was like really heavily campaigning for specific candidates, independents showed up in droves to vote against those candidates. Well, again, fewer Republicans than Democrats. The Republicans have never won the presidency without capturing 2/3 of the independent vote. They're going to lose the independent vote. So now we're not just talking about a defeat, we're talking about a rout. Third, RF Kennedy Jr. Trump thought he had cornered the batshit crazy vote, and now it's split. So you're talking about a loss of vote even in strongholds. And this is before he became a convicted felon. So we're looking at the second or third worst electoral defeat for any presidential candidate in American history. I mean, this is going to be like Goldwater or worse, assuming Biden doesn't die. If Biden doesn't die, if Biden dies, I reserve the right to change my mind. But that's where we are today.
Well, let's assume for one reason or another that you're incorrect and Trump wins.
Sure.
What do you see as some of the things that he would do, or perhaps some of the risks of a second Trump term?
Well, the only thing that we know that he would do for certain is be as tough on China as Biden. Now, they have a very, very similar policy when it comes to international economic affairs. In fact, I would argue that the two most similar presidents we've ever had in that regard, coming from different points and applying policy differently, but getting to the same general result of basically dividing the Chinese system from the American system. And while I could sit back here in armchair quarterback for both of their strategies, but how they could do it with less pain or more effectiveness, most Americans are broadly on board with that push. And Trump does deserve credit for starting that conversation. But beyond that, Trump's policies are basically shaped by whoever flattered him most recently. And I can't predict that. If it happens to be somebody in Mexico, then Mexican relations will be great. If it happens to be Putin, then look out Ukraine. But if Zelensky gets to him first, look out Russia. He's unpredictable because he has no attention span. He ignores the information that is available to him. He ignores his advisors, assuming that he doesn't fire them outright. So predicting the specifics, I can tell you, though, that the general engagement through government assets, whether it's the military, the bureaucracy, the State Department, he just doesn't use those tools in a way that a normal president would, and just makes everything very erratic.
If Biden wins, of course, as you predict, do you have a sense of any changes in direction or policy modifications when he will not have any more races to run?
In foreign policy, I would expect it to be reasonably steady state. So again, steady reduction in anything that globalization has to do, no new trade deals, ever tighter restrictions on the Chinese, moving down the technological platform from things that the Chinese have no chance of doing themselves to things where the Chinese are dependent on foreign supply chains, and then only in the later on things where the Chinese are dependent on foreign markets, basically ratcheting up the pressure steadily. On domestic affairs, it really depends upon what happens with the Congress. I think at this point, it's kind of a shoo-in that the Democrats are going to win the House. The question is the Senate. Now, normally, and until a month ago, I would have said that the Republicans will probably hold the majority in the Senate. There's 33 seats up. 20 of those are being defended by Democrats. In order to get a majority, the Democrats would have to defend every seat and then get 10 more seats from the Republicans. That just doesn't happen. I mean, I'm sorry, not majority, cloture. They have to get 60 seats in order to basically control things. I would have said no way. And then Trump was convicted. And so there are going to be negative coattails for Trump in this scenario. The question is how big. But I have gone in the last month from thinking there was no chance that the Republicans could lose the Senate to that degree to all of a sudden, like it's within the realm of possibility. Now, if we have that sort of just dynamic blowout, then we're going to find out just how economically liberal and incompetent the Biden team can be. I have not been impressed by their domestic economic policy. I was not impressed by Trump's economic policy. I was not impressed by Obama's economic policy. It's been a long time since we had someone who could do math in the White House. Odds are, strong presidential result, strong House result, both for the Democrats, and then a split Senate or probably even a Republican majority. As long as the Republicans have 50 seats, there's a break. That's probably where we're going.
So clearly, your analysis, generally speaking, based on demography, based on including the fact that we are surrounded by two oceans here in the U.S., based on just the dynamics in the rest of the world, the United States is positioned to be the big winner in the years, decades ahead. What capacity do you feel is that the government has to potentially slow our progress, or be the one thing that gets in the way of that outcome?
Well, I'm firmly in the beggars can't be choosers camp. We need to basically double our industrial plant to prepare for a post-globalization world, because we won't be able to import those finished goods or maybe the intermediate goods that are important in our own manufacturing. With the benefit of hindsight, I think a lot of people realize that we should have started building this out years ago as opposed to relatively recently. But I mean, here's the thing. Think of, say, the Inflation Reduction Act. A couple $1 trillion of investment into various green tech to build out new industrial plants so we can compete in these spaces. The economist in me is like, this is wildly inefficient. But we're kind of on the clock. And even if we build with subsidies an industrial plant that isn't perfect for what we need 5, 10 years from now, we're still building out the electrical systems, the physical infrastructure, moving the populations that are necessary to have what we need at the end. And if we have to retool this stuff between now and then, fine. The efficient time to start this process was 2010. We started in 2021. I'll take what I can get at this point. And even if we're not building the perfect thing, we're building something that we can then reuse.
Talk about the role of immigration. The countries
Mm.
we've spoken about primarily, the only one that has a history of immigration is the United States. And in many ways, actually, our demography is the primary benefit demographically. The fact that we are a young nation, in many cases, because of immigration. Talk about the role that plays as a potential force multiplier to the advantages of the United States relative to some of the other countries you're talking
Yeah,
about.
the issue is for immigration to be a meaningful part of the solution is it has to be something that has deep roots, and you have to have a society that can regularly assimilate relatively large numbers of people without changing the core identity of the country to the point that it triggers a backlash. Now, in the United States here, we're kind of on a sine curve. We have highs and lows, and right now we're definitely at a low. Trump basically criminalized all legal routes, something that Biden doubled down on, which he should get full credit for that or full blame based on where you are. Which means that the only way to come into the United States now is to come in illegally. And that's why we're seeing a surge of people from Russia and from India, from China at the southern border, because we've closed off all the normal ways that they would have used to get here. I will point out that we brought in about 2 million people illegally last year. And if it not for those people going into the workforce, our inflation problem would be much higher than it is right now, at least double, probably triple. Until such time as our political system settles, I don't think we're going to be able to have a meaningful conversation about immigration in the United States, which means we won't probably have a change in our current structure for 5 years. It's a missed opportunity because as we see countries fall apart around the world, now is the time to be setting up the policies so you can hoover up that labor and those skilled workforces. And we're not going to be able to benefit from that. Not a lot of places are. Really, the only country I would argue that has kind of made immigration kind of a day in, day out part of their system is Canada. But even they are experiencing some significant backlash because when you bring in a large number of people year on year and year for 15 years, they all need homes and they're relatively price insensitive when they go looking for them because you have to have one. And so there's now an affordability crisis in most of the major metros in Canada, with most of the people who were born in Canada no longer being able to afford a house. It's a different sort of problem. It's not perceived as a crime issue, it's perceived as a cost of living issue. So The smart play now would be to have a degree of immigration reform that doesn't just toughen up the border, but opens up new avenues for people to come in legally. But until we can have that conversation, immigration is not part of the solution in a traditional sense. We might be able to bring in, wrong word probably, a lot of illegals to do work to keep inflation under control, but that's about it. We're
Fascinating.
missing out on what should be right now the greatest skills transfer in modern history.
What other countries are you bullish on in terms of their long-term prospects beyond the United States?
Well, the first one is one that, from a demographic point of view, looks like a no brainer for being a failure, and that'd be Japan. It's the oldest demographic structure in the world. They have managed to bring their birth rate back up, or at least retard its reduction. But under Trump, they were able to cut a trade deal that was humiliating, which almost brought them into the American inner circle of allies. And they're basically doubling and tripling down on that right now. So they found a way to get access to the US market over the long term, and a merger of security interests over the long term that I think will do them very, very well. I'm also very bullish on Mexico. If it wasn't for Americans' obsession with cocaine, this would be one of the most successful states in the world. And their demographic structure perfectly complements ours. They're already on the verge of having $1 trillion consumer market because of their structure. So it's not just a source of manufacturing for us, it's also an export partner, which is very, very important. Southeast Asia looks very good for similar reasons and has less cocaine. Young population, multifaceted manufacturing system, and it's, as a region, probably the part of the world that will benefit the most from industry moving out of the People's Republic. They're at a similar state. They have several states that are at a similar stage of economic development that are actually far more economically efficient already. And there aren't a lot of local military competitions that are a serious problem. So you can end globalization on a global level, but still have a regional globalized system within Southeast Asia that can then trade with Japan and the United States. Those are my big three.
We've talked about a number of countries that are on negative trajectories that you believe can't be corrected. Are there any that have negative trajectories that can? And if so, what are the actions they need to take?
Well, I mean, I'll never sell short the Koreans because they keep rewriting the rules of physics to make things happen. But I mean, their demographics are like the second or third worst in the world. Uh, I'm interested in Poland right now. Poland today is kind of like Mexico. Poland versus Germany is a little bit like Mexico versus the United States. But whereas a lot of the other European countries have aged out, the Poles still have a lot of people aged roughly 30 to 50. And if they can build out a pro family natalist policy system, the idea that they could regenerate their population over the next 20 years is not beyond the pale. But if they don't do it soon, they're going to run out of time. They'll have a moment when Germany has failed, when Russia has failed, and they're like the guiding star of Europe at that point. But it's only a moment unless they can get their demographics back up. Watch Turkey, positive demographics. Again, kind of like that Mexico US sort of thing between Turkey and Europe. France, healthiest demography in the rich world outside of the United States. They've got some issues to work out, but unlike Germany or the United States, they never spread out their manufacturing system. It's not as efficient as a result, and they've kind of missed out on a growth boom these last 30, 40 years. But as globalization fades away, they actually don't have to retool much to take advantage of the world in the form it's going to be in.
How about the UK? All the data seems to suggest that there's now a pretty strong majority that feel that Brexit was a mistake. Any chances in your mind that there would be a reversal?
I am never going to tell a country what to do when it comes to international organization membership because there's just too many pieces in play. Now, when Brexit was first brought up, what was it, 10 years ago? I was like, well, I can see the point of that because without globalization, the EU has no chance, especially once you think that the Germans who pay for everything are aging out and aren't going to be able to pay for everything. So getting out ahead of it, figuring out what's next, that made some sense to me. It's been 7 years since the Brexit vote, and the Brits have done nothing. And they basically wasted the last decade. And now their demographic problems are starting to bite. Now, they're not nearly as bad as Italy's or Germany's or Russia's or China's, but they are serious. What the Brits need to do is make up their goddamn mind of what Brexit actually means. And it's too late now to go back into the EU and try to salvage it. So they do need a third way. The only way that I can see that that works now is to basically get into NAFTA. And if they decide to do that, the United States will browbeat a number of concessions into the agreement that the Brits really don't want to agree. They will never have as good of a deal as they had with the European Union if they go with the United States. But there isn't a sufficiently large source of consumption anywhere else within reach. If it's the United States, or you become a failed middle power. None of these are good solutions for the British ego.
So humiliation like Japan, but with longer term positive implications of bending the
Right,
knee.
exactly. I mean, the world has changed, and it's changing in a direction that is not favorable for what the Brits have normally been good at. So they're going to have to take a deal that they don't want, or they have to go it completely alone, and that doesn't look nearly as friendly.
Who do you see as America's primary rival as the century rolls on?
I think we're going to take about 20
Pregnant
years off
pause.
from even having that conversation. We have to figure out, when I say we, I mean humanity, has to figure out what the economic model is for a post-globalized, post-demographic collapse world. And until we know what that is, and we haven't really started investigating that yet, we can't imagine what the geography of success for that new model is going to be. Because whatever it is, it can't be based on consumption, production, or investment. Those are the three pillars. Well, consumption, production, investment, and labor, those are the four pillars of all economic models in the world today. And they're not going to be relevant in 20 years on a global basis. So until we figure out what that new model is, I have no idea.
Peter Zeihan, thank you so much for joining me again today. Always a pleasure to have access to your insights and to spend a little time with you. I'm grateful for it.
My pleasure.